What was that breakthrough moment in your lives, like that aha moment that really got you to experience, yourselves and live a more hopeful, happy life?
For me, there were actually two. They were about 4 or 5 days apart from each other. The first was when I came here to the banks of Ganga, now 20 and a half years ago. I was 25 in the midst of a PhD in psychology. I was not spiritual. I was definitely not religious, and I was not one of those people even who say, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. In retrospect, of course, now that my understanding of spirituality has grown, I can, of course, look back and say, oh yeah, here were the pieces. But at the time, I would not have even self-identified as a spiritual seeker at all. I came to India just on a travel break in the midst of a PhD program. And I was a scientist and doing pediatric neuropsychology. I had graduated from Stanford undergrad and was then getting a PhD. And I was really very focused, and here's what the equation that the world gives us you need for happiness. You need to have a good degree from a good university, then you need to get a good job, and you need to have a nice house in the right area of town, and a picket fence that's just about the right height, and you need to look the right way, and all of these pieces. And for me at the time, I had really put the pieces together, and so we were what I now refer to as happy by default, where we had the pieces, but what we didn't have was actually a real experience of what joy is. So, came to India traveling. I stand on the banks of Ganga, pretty much just where we do Aarti every night, although I didn't know Aarti, I didn't know Parmarth. We were staying in a hotel. And I had an experience on the banks of Ganga in which it was literally as though a veil that I had had over my eyes for 25 years was just pulled off. And everything that I thought I had understood, everything I thought about who I was, what the universe was just in a split second over. And I literally was knocked to the ground and I burst into tears. They weren't sad tears, of course, but they weren't even happy tears. They were just tears of being in the presence of the truth. It was a visual experience of literally beholding the divine. It was a physiological experience of being one with that which I was beholding. And it was more real than anything I had ever experienced, anything I'd ever been taught, anything I'd ever learned, any goal I ever thought I had had. And so in that moment, who I thought I was, what I thought the universe was, it was over. And although I certainly couldn't articulate in any way what I now was experiencing, in fact, I just kept crying and saying, it's so beautiful, it's so beautiful, it's so beautiful. And that was all it was. It was just so beautiful. And so that was really the first experience that just turned my entire perception, because nothing had changed about me, the physical being. I was the same one who had walked down to the banks of Ganga 5 minutes earlier. And yet everything had changed. And so, yeah. And then about 5 days later, I'm going to fast forward through this really quickly, but I had met Puja Swamiji, and I finally was in a situation of having an opportunity to speak to him. And it was a time where he would answer questions, and he turned to me and he said, "Yes?" And suddenly I was in a state of panic because I didn't have a question, but I was a straight A student, like I was a star academic, and here I was on call. I had to come up with something. And my brain immediately started doing this, and so I asked him about fear. It was something that I had struggled with in my life, and I said, "Tell me about fear. Why do we fear?" And he said, "You fear because you don't trust." Okay. And I then gave him my story, the details of which are not relevant. We all have our stories. But to me, my story was a really good one. It was true, of course. It wasn't a fictional story on this physical plane of existence. And it was a story that for 25 years of life had gotten me a lot of, "Oh my God, oh, you poor thing." And it was a story that for me really explained any time I needed a reason to not be stepping up to the plate of my life, to not be able to be in the present, to not be able to embrace who I was. Well, I had this story, and it was a good story. And everyone's response to the story was, "Oh, yeah. Oh, you know." And I got my head in a lot of people's laps with them, doing this. And Swamiji looked at me and he said, "Are you going to take that to the grave?" Now, I was 25. And I said, "Well, God, no, Swamiji, of course not." And he said, "Well, so are you going to let it go a day before you die?" And I said, "Well, no, I mean," he said, "How about a month before you die?" And I was silent. I didn't know how to answer that question. Was he saying I was going to die soon? What was his point? And he looked at me and he said, "You're waiting for someone to come in and draw the line for you. For someone to come in and say, 'Okay, now you can let it go.'" He said, "No one will. That's up to you." And he said, "You can carry it to your grave. You can let it go a day before you die, a week before you die, a month before you die, or tonight." And he said, "We have this beautiful ceremony called the Arti." And he said, "I'm going to tell them to give you the fire so you can wave the fire." And he said, "And after that, I want you to go and stand in Ganga. And I want you to hold Ganga water in your hands. And I want you to take that whole story, all the pain, every aspect of that story, and I want you to offer it to Ganga." Now, I was a scientist, and I was an arrogant and slightly obnoxious scientist. And my journal entries for that day, I was perfectly polite in front of him, but I used to keep a journal, and my journal entries for that day say things like, "Give it to the river." He says that I should just give it to the river, as though it were an apple core or a banana peel, rather than my life. And at some point, late afternoon, early evening, I had this moment in which some wise part of me came in and said, "Okay, look. Yes, it sounds quaint. Yes, it sounds sweet. Yes, it even sounds really simplistic. And thank God you've got a world of psychotherapy to go back to who understands the need for a process and understands how long these things take. But right now, You're here. And maybe the point of you coming thousands of miles and winding up in front of this master in orange robes who tells you to give it to the river, maybe there was something in that. And so I committed to myself one thing and one thing only, which was I would do it sincerely. I had no concept that it would work. In fact, I was pretty sure it wouldn't. But I made a commitment simply to sincerity, that I would take the message and do what he asked me to do with sincerity. And I stood in Ganga, with Ganga in my hands, for I have no idea how long. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried, and I stood, and I stood, and I stood. And then it was given. And 20 and a half years later, what I can tell you is it really was given. And it was the sort of thing that, of course, defied everything that I understood about psychology, everything that I understood about anything in the universe. The river doesn't just take our childhood, doesn't just take our pain. But what it made so clear was that there was an I who was separate from that. Because look, here I am standing in the river, and there goes the pain. And there was an I who walked out of the river, and an I who walked back up the ashram without the story, without the identity. And that awareness was for me the moment of realizing that it was never me to begin with. And that who I was this being that was now walking back up into the ashram. And that's been something since then that I've held so dearly and have been so committed to inviting and opening and trying to provide opportunities for more and more people to experience that, because it works, it happens.
In my particular situation, there are very many parallels exactly to what Sadhviji was saying. I was a scientist, and as a scientist, we don't bring spirituality and mind into the story. It's all genes and cells and molecules and all that. And my research on stem cells revealed that while I was teaching in medical school that genes control life, my research revealed that it was the environment in which the cells lived that controlled the cells. It was outside information coming into the cells. And I remember how specifically, in a moment of time, that I was working on trying to understand the mechanics from a molecular point of view. How does an environmental signal control biology? And I was working not on the genes, I was working on the skin of the cell, the membrane. And it was so profound, it's hard for me to even describe it. I'm working on the understanding, how does information from the environment control biology? And I had looked at the membrane for years, and I wrote a new definition of the mechanism of the membrane. And I wrote this definition, and this is in 1985. It was about 2 a.m., and I wrote down the membrane is a liquid crystal semiconductor with gates and channels. When I wrote that down, there was a pause, and I said, I read something exactly like that. And right next to my first computer, a Macintosh, was a book from a simple book of understanding your microprocessor. And I opened it up, and I said, somewhere, and I opened it right in the introduction. It said, a chip is a crystal semiconductor with gates and channels. And I thought, oh, what a coincidence. They have the same definition. And then in a couple of seconds, I started to say, wait a minute. one for one. The parts are exactly the same. I said, oh my God. The membrane is a computer chip. And on the surface of the cell are like keys, like on a typewriter. And I started to realize, oh my goodness, the environment is typing on the surface of the cell information that went into the cell and control the genetics and the behavior. And it was like, oh, this is really exciting. And I'm typing on my own computer, typing this information in, and then I realized I am outside of the computer, typing on the keyboard, and the information is coming up on the computer. And then I said, oh my God. The keyboard on the surface of your cells has a number of keys that represent a PIN number, a personal identification number. And no two of you have the same keys on that. Each of us have a different PIN number to get into our own cells. It's our personal identity. And these are the keys. And I realized, oh my God, well, we've been focusing on these, what are called receptors, as the source of identity. I realized, no, it's what's activating, what's typing is the identity. And then it hit me and I said, oh my God, my identity is not in the cell. My identity is a signal coming from the environment, typing on the keyboard. And then I said, oh. And the first thing that hit me was, I can't die. I'm not even in here. And that instant, the fear, which all of us have in our deepest bottom belief system, is a fear of our mortality. And when that moment of like, I can't die, not as a devotional belief, it had nothing to do with that, it was just a mechanism, I said, oh my God, I can't die. I tell you, the same thing happened with Sadhvi as me. Tears started rolling down my face, and this joy was an ache in my heart that I've never experienced before. I spent 40 years in my head. That's how I became an academician and a research scientist. And when this moment hit, it was my heart that blew open. I refer to it as a heart orgasm. And, and that was the first time I experienced my heart as an essential part of my own conscious existence. And what happened was, I was overwhelmed, first with the fact that I was not spiritual at 1:59 a.m., and at 2 a.m., I was 100% spiritual, with no devotional interface in between. and then I have to add this, because this becomes the next important step. Yes, I saw this, I understood it, it was beautiful, it was in my conscious awareness, my knowledge, my learning, and I got so excited, I wanted to tell people, and I couldn't wait to get some people together, and I'd bring them into the room and I say, let me explain this mechanism, because if you understand this mechanism, you'll understand you are the most powerful creator that exists. And I couldn't wait to tell them, and I'd get up there and I'd tell them, and then the audience would look at me and go, you know, Lipton, your life doesn't look that good if you really think that's true, because your life doesn't represent anything you just said. And there was a pause, and I started to realize, it's like, and I almost said this, so I want to thank the universe for not making me so foolish. I almost said, well, do as I say and not as I do. It was then the most important lesson, number 2, and that was this: I don't care how much knowledge is in your head. If that knowledge doesn't go into your subconscious, your life will stay exactly the same as it was. You can be the brightest, smartest academic, and I say, fine, did it change your life? And the answer is no. You have to take the knowledge that you are walking within your conscious mind and put that knowledge into your subconscious programming. And when you do that, you are all powerful in the creation of your own life. And so just walking around and being able to recite all these wonderful sayings and things that you hear from all the wonderful teachers that we have, and you say, oh yes, I remember that, that's a good quote, that's a nice quote, oh that's a wonderful saying. It's irrelevant until that saying becomes part of your program, because now you are living from the saying and not talking about the saying. And that was the total transformation of a life that on an academic level, was successful on a personal level. I don't even want to talk about that. But it changed everything. Why? Because instead of having to chase after life, after this understanding, things came to me. The light will bring it to you. The only thing that's in your way of the light is a block in your belief that other people have put into your programming. You take your knowledge that you have, make it your subconscious program, and you will manifest all of the wonderful spiritual wisdom that you have heard throughout your whole life. Is not words now. It is life and behavior. And that's our destination. Thank you.
Thank you.